Always being up here is always nervous, so it's not as easy as we may think. So, there are some topics that are taboo during the holidays. So, give me some topics that you don't really like talking about during the holidays. Politics. We don't like talking about politics, right? When you go to your Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner, when politics comes up, it's usually problematic. What are some other topics? Religion. We don't like to really bring up religion, especially if you have family members that don't believe what you believe. What normally happens at that point in time? The food, no more food, right? You go off on a whole nother tangent. So there are some topics that are taboo during the holidays. Bringing up religion, that's one. Salaries. Do we talk about salaries during the holidays? No, we shouldn't, right? The weight gain, right? When these topics are brought up, what normally happens? You have a loud, awkward silence, right? But they said here, but the conversation that eclipses these is politics. It strains family relationships. When we have political conversations, what normally happens? Does it normally end well if you are on opposite end of the spectrum? So let me ask you a question. Have you ever persuaded a family member to change their point of view in a political discussion? So why do we have it? Just to think about it. So it strains family relationship, it leads to loud verbal exchanges, and causes indigestion even before the meal is finished. Stanford scholar Santo Yanga says that politics overrides other social categories of self-identification, such as gender, race, religion, language, and ethnicity, because these are ascribed at birth, whereas politics, you choose those views yourself. Because of the heat associated with politics, we often transfer it to the inner sanctum of privacy to avoid further pain. However, with constant news cycle and the pressure of public dialogue, there are always waves of political conversations that try to force an opinion out of us, right? So, for example, presidential elections. Do we keep to ourselves with that? It's all over, right? I don't like those times. Why? Everywhere you go, there's something being advertised, right? Even on the kids' games, there's stuff being advertised. So, the presidential election, the latest tragedy in social relations, this week, a video was released. We saw what that invoked in people, right? All around us, it's there. Another thing, when we have a pending Supreme Court decision, we are all in anticipation. How is this going to turn out? What is it going to do? What is it going to say? Roe v. Wade, what are they going to go? Papers leaked, right? It's all around us. We are always encapsulated by by political elections, by other stuff, right? We shrink from the wariness of politics, yes, are tempted to engage its passion. Social media, with all its promises to promote dialogue and discussion, has only added to and accelerated this condition. Can we go on social media without getting involved in these things? No. Oh, guys, I want you guys to at least nod. I'm nervous, so if you could support me by nodding, by saying an amen ever so often, so I know you guys are with me, right? All right, amen. So let's do that. As Bible-believing Seventh-day Adventists, how are we to navigate through the rapids of politics? At what point do we participate or disengage? Which values of political parties do we subscribe to, and which should we avoid? How are we to vote as contributors to democracy, but also as those looking for the second coming of Jesus Christ? So these are questions that we all have to contemplate, right? Do I engage? Do I not engage? Do I participate? Do I not participate? What do we do with politics? So that's the purpose of this. With these questions, perhaps you already start questioning the author, right? Because you're saying, what's the views of the author? Have you thought about that? But he's going to tell you what it is. To suspicious already, with these questions, perhaps you are already questioning the political position of the author. This suspicion already evidence of our sensitivity and politicized situation. The goal of this article is not to provide a resolution to a political question or persuade a political predisposition of a party. Rather, it is an attempt for a politically fragile soul to provide principles on navigating faith amidst politics. So that's the purpose of this. We are fatigued. We are fatigued by the continuous politics, by the continuous onslaught in the media. So this article is just to help us navigate this part. The author has no legal background, does not enjoy political discussions, but merely hopes to offer practical approaches for the purpose of this article. So what would we use in this? We will be looking at scriptures and the writing of Ellen White, as well as quotes from a few historical Adventist leaders as sources for these principles. So let's take our Bibles and turn to Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 7. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 7. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. The English Standard Version. So let's read. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whosoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. All right? So what lessons can we learn from this text? So first, it is clear that Christians are to obey the governments because they have authorization by God to exercise power. Right? We're in agreement with that. The second one, Christians are not called to anarchy or other forms of chaos or lawlessness. Right? So we follow the laws. Third, we are to pay taxes, obey laws, and respect the officers of power. Right? So these are the conclusions we get from this. But question, notably, we must also couple this passage with the admonition of Revelation 13. What does Revelation 13 say? Well, the whole chapter encapsulates where Bible-believing and Christian followers' beliefs will be called. So basically what this chapter is saying, if the values that the state is imposing upon us goes against the values of God, what are we supposed to do? Who are we supposed to follow at that time? We follow God. So that's the time where we will have civil disobedience, but that's only if the state imposes something on us that goes against what God says. Though given by God, the question arises of what the role of government power is, based on where the old houses of French government sat. Right wing, what does right wing mean? Okay, I'll read it then. I'll just give you the definition. Okay. Right wing sides denotes the stance of limited power of government, whereas the left wing side denotes the stand for increased power. Though political discussion should focus on how much power government has, they have been relegated to who has power, whether it is the rich or the poor, white or black, educated or uneducated, or whether social delineation have chosen. Rather than who, we must turn our attention to understanding the role of power in government. While our knee-jerk reaction may be to hold back power, in some instances, power must be exercised for. Why should power be exercised? For justice, for mercy, and for the good of the people. Right? This is where the separation of church and state comes in. Church and state represents the two great powers. If one were to take the state and boil it in a pot until the water evaporated and it became a syrup, and continue to reduce it until it became a crystal, what would be the central core of the state? What would you say is the central core of the state? Essentially, The state is the power of force. That's what the state is. The state is the power of force. So let me explain. This force has been given to the state by the people through a social contract, giving it the ability to force citizens to pay financial penalties, to pay taxes, to remove them from society, as in the case of incarceration, and even in some jurisdictions to die. The state uses force. So let's take a look at this. If you don't pay your taxes, what happens? You're fined and you go to jail, right? So let's look at the state in general. How does the state execute when we do something wrong? It has to be by force, right? And we as people, when we vote government officials in, we give them that authority to do those things. So the state is about force, right? So now let's look at the church. If one were to do the same experiment with the church, what would be the primary component at its core? Any congregation would offer. So let me just ask this question. What would you say is the core value of the church? Oh, it's a question, guys. To promote Christ, to promote love. What else? To the gospel commission. So, let me continue. You guys are right. If one were to do the same experiment with the church, what would be the primary component at its core? Any congregation would offer a variety of answers. Often, all of them are correct. But essentially, the church encapsulates the power of conversion. So that's the goal of the church. So the purpose of the state is force. The purpose of the church at its core is conversion. In the churches, in the Christian church's context, the Holy Spirit worked through the preached word of God made possible by the ministry of Christ, and the individual heart is supernaturally changed or converted. So that's the purpose of the church. At the core of separation of church and state is a healthy relationship between force and conversion, and this is epitomized by when we read Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. That's what give unto Caesar what is due unto Caesar. In other words, the state ensures that the church and all religions do their thing. In the United States, through the establishment clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution, religious liberty is founded where religious organizations are free to preach, to teach, and grow, and, in the case of Christianity, promote the spiritual regenerative conversion of the heart. That's the role the state has. It allows religion and all religions to be free. When we studied for our citizenship test, right, one of the things we learned is that you could have a religion or practice no religion, right? So that's the purpose of the state. The purpose of the state is to stay out of the church's business, right? Because we will see when the state gets involved with the church, what happens. Most liberal democracies do not have a state church, but imagine if the state forces was used to promote the church's conversion. So let's look at some examples. This may touch a couple of you guys. A tax for those who came to church late. So if you came to church late, if we had to use the state way, right? If I could use the state force, if you came to church late, you pay a tax. Would everybody come to church early? I think everybody will come to church early. Do you want to pay a tax? Okay. The next one, those sleeping during the sermon would be imprisoned. So if anybody sleep today, they could be imprisoned, right? Missing tithe remits with results. If you miss tithe, guess what they're going to do? They could deduct it from your 401k. Let's think about it. Another one. If you pull your cell phone out, what's going to be the penalty for pulling your cell phone out in church? You lose access to your cell phone for the rest of your life. So we see here, wouldn't that be ridiculous? Right? It will be ridiculous for those things, right? However, they are indeed advocates for this relationship of church and state. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, we need to be careful what we're asking for. Right? Let's look at this. After all, it was usually However, there are individuals who want this. After all, it would surely increase religious attendance, religious donation, and religious participation. If these measures were taken, would people come to church? I may beg to differ a lot, because if you stay home from church, you have to pay a tax, right? So more likely than not, people may want to come to church more. If you don't return your tithe and your offering, guess what happened? They take it out of your 401k. Who wants that? Nobody wants that, right? But if you do those things, why are you doing it? You're doing it because of force, right? History attests to the further abuse of the mismatch of church and state. Look at the great controversy. Let's look at the Dark Ages. What happened during the Dark Ages? Persecution. Who persecuted the people? The church used the state's force to enforce what they're doing. So we see when these two come together, it creates a problem, right? And then we have some modern day examples. In some Latin American countries, we have the Roman Catholicism. In various European countries, and we have Protestantism. And in the Middle East, we have some states are run by the Islamic governance. And then in Southern Asia, we have Buddhism. If we were to do that in the United States, which religion will be the dominant religion? Because sometimes we call for that, right? We call for getting back to certain things. But if we get back to that, which religion will be dominant? As Christians, though, we believe in the power and authority of the state to protect. We also believe in the inherent power of the Spirit to convert through the power of the Word. If the state enforces what the church should be preaching, this combination ironically demonstrates the weakness of the church and its message. Governments must stay neutral regarding religious truths. They must protect the ability of religions to promote, communicate, and preach their truths. So that's the role. So now let's take a look at Adventist history. Where did we start off? Where did we end? Where do we go? So as we shift to early Adventism, many took on a separation of church and state to the other extreme. What they believed in was apoliticalism, right? So what is A? If you see A in front of a word, what does that mean? None. They said none at all, right? So let's look at some of the text. Politics was discouraged. Many did not discuss issues that were relevant to the second coming of Christ. Moreover, some early Adventists thought if they voted for a particular party or body, they were held culpable for all its actions and abuses. Under these circumstances, if I cast my vote at all, it will tell for or against the making of the image. So some people believe if I voted for or against, I was actually promoting, or they were promoting, the ideas of the image. If I vote in favor of the formation of the image, I shall aid in creating an admonition which will persecute the church. So what they did, so in essence, what they're saying here is, if I voted, what I was doing, I was actually enforcing the image to do its work. On the other hand, if I voted against this work, I shall vote against the fulfillment of prophecy. So if you voted, you supported it. If you didn't vote, you were not, the prophecy will not be fulfilled. Therefore, I cannot vote at all. So that was the stance of the early church. The early Seventh-day Adventist church was to stay away from politics altogether. So later Adventism transitions its political attitude. Many rallied against the legalization of alcohol in what is known as the temperance movement. Do you guys know about the temperance movement? So the temperance movement now, they wanted to legalize the legalization of alcohol, so the church took a different stand. So it's saying now, we don't want that, so we're going to vote against it. Ellen White herself wrote, men of intemperance have been in office today in a flattering manner, expressing their approbation of the cause of the course of the Sabbath keepers not voting and expressed hope that they will stick to their course and, like the Quakers, not cast their vote. Satan and his evil angels are busy at this time, and he has workers upon the earth. May Satan be disappointed in my prayer. Shall we vote for prohibition? She asked. Yes, to a man everywhere, she replied. And perhaps, this really shocked me. And she said, and perhaps I shall shock some of you if I say, if necessary, vote on the Sabbath day for prohibition if you cannot at any other time. That statement shocked me. But I'm sure some of you have seen that before. So what she's saying here is, in this vote for prohibition, if you couldn't vote on any other day, she was saying you could do it on the Sabbath. Adventists were so involved in politics that then General Conference President George Butler admonishes against too much involvement, yet simultaneously he advocated for the temperance movement. We hope every Seventh-day Adventist voter in the state of Iowa will vote for this law and induce all others to do so whom he can influence by honorable means. Clearly, a shift has occurred from apoliticalism to a full political engagement. So that's the movement of the church. First, it started with nothing at all. Then it became so entrenched in everything. The temperance movement came to an apex when the 18th Amendment for prohibition was proposed in 1917. 2 years later, the amendment was ratified, and 1 year after that, the amendment was implemented. Because of its political success, temperance organizations were unfunded. By 1933, the 21st Amendment had repealed the 18th, and it was too late to recapture any political momentum. So Ellen White did not get to see what happened to her temperance advocacy as she died in 1915. But it is interesting to see her support of politics, especially in light of service. Many a lad of today, growing up as in Daniel, in the Judaism home, studying God's word and his work, and learning the lessons of faithful service, will yet stand in legislative assemblies, in halls of justice, or in the royal courts as a witness for the King of Kings. Are you ambitious for education that you may have a name and position in the world? Have you thoughts that you dare not express, that you may one day sit in deliberative and legislative councils and help to enact laws for the nation? There is nothing wrong in these aspirations, but the life of John was not spent in idleness. He was ever an interested observer of what was passing in the world. For his quiet retreat, he watched the unfolding of events. Clearly, she saw the value of political office, its influence, and was not a proponent of apoliticalism. So now we'll get into the principles that we could apply to our lives. I'm almost finished. So I know this may be hard, but I'm almost done. These are the large principles that we are working with. Adventists acknowledge and respect government. Adventists should separate church and state. Adventists should get involved in society, but on the individual level. How are we to interact with the world of politics? As Seventh-day Adventists, several practical principles are proposed. So I'll go through 7 of them now. So the first one is vote for virtue. So if you're going to vote for virtue. And I'll give the supporting evidence. Voting is private and personal. So voting is not a corporate thing. The next thing, avoid parties. And we'll explain why they said to avoid parties. Avoid political questions. Next, vote as from an Adventist framework. Number 6, get involved as an Adventist. And then the last one is rely on sacred faith. So now let's go through these. It won't take too much longer. Vote for virtue. How can Christian men and women tolerate this evil? There is a cause for the moral paralysis upon society. Our laws sustain an evil which is sapping their very foundation. Many deploy the wrongs which they now exist but consider themselves free from all responsibilities in this manner. This cannot be. Every individual exerts an influence in society. It is our favored land. Every voter has some voice in determining what laws shall control the nation. Should not that influence and that vote be cast on the side of tolerance and virtue? Adventists should look at the motive of which they vote. Is it for virtue or for that which is good? Or are there ulterior motives, retirement security, financial prosperity, or anything else like that? Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12 says, the word discerns the inner heart, and we are to take each decision to the Lord, whether we can honestly say that we are voting for virtue. So in this situation, what it's saying, if you're in indecision, you take it to the Lord. Because what happens a lot of times, we sit among ourselves and we discuss. We can't persuade each other. So this is saying, vote for virtue if you have to. Voting is private. And this is a quote from Sister White. Keep your voting to yourself. Do not feel it your duty to urge everyone to do as you do. In an age of social media, the pressure exists to push our social circles, the ideas we hold dear, or to react to what others have posted, rather than politicize our political preferences and urge them to be conform. Voting should remain private and personal. And we see that all the time, right? During the political season, how many times do you have to unfriend people? No, serious. Well, you don't have to answer. But sometimes we get to the point where our personal views get in the way of representing Christ. Everything you post on social media, is it glorifying God? Because if you're posting things that are causing issues, we need to get away from it, brothers and sisters. We need to. Because some of us get nasty. When it's election time, we get really nasty. So this is saying, your voting, if you decide to vote, is private. I don't need to know who you're voting for. The next one is avoid parties. Why do we avoid parties? We cannot with safety vote for political parties, for we do not know whom we are voting for. Do we know who we're voting for at times? No, we don't. We cannot with safety take part in any political schemes. It is a mistake for you to link your interests with any political party, to cast your vote with them or for them. God employs the strongest figure to show that there should be no union between worldly parties and those who are seeking the righteousness of Christ. Partyism is a tool in which strong social reinforcement overrules rationale. I'll explain more. There is an inherent in-group bias with parties, right? When we go with parties, there is a certain bias within the group that we have to uphold. In that, no matter how reasonable and logical the other side is, there is deep antagonism. Partyism appeals to identity. Partyism appeals to identities that people have of themselves, which outrank any other sociological category. It causes unnecessary disagreements that tear the middle apart to gain votes. Political parties lead to groupthink, addiction to political pundits, and ultimately disrupt relationships, contradicting the message of Christ. Anything that tears us apart, we need to avoid it. At election times, you're Democrat, you're Republican, you're liberal. When we bring those things into the church, it only causes separation. I've never seen a political discussion on opposite ends of the spectrum bring people together. So this is saying, avoid the parties. Avoid political questions. That's number 4. the Lord would have his people bury political questions. Let political questions alone. The tithe should not be used to pay anyone for speechifying on the political questions. Every teacher, minister, or leader in our ranks who is stirred with the desire to vent his opinion on political questions should be converted by a belief in the truth or give up his work. And this is, Sister White, this is taken from reference 15 from Fundamentals of Christian Education. God calls upon the teachers in our school not to become interested in a study of political questions. These political questions are politicized ideas of the day. They are different from moral stance. As tithe has been set aside for the salary of those in the gospel work, these teachers, pastors, and leaders using their platforms for political issues, avoiding the holiness of the tithe. We should let alone political issues of the day, but rather focus on underlining moral principles. Number 5. Vote as from an Adventist framework. The image to the beast represents the form of apostate Protestantism, which will be developed when the Protestant church shall seek the aid of civil power for the enforcement of their dogma. Do we see that today? We see a lot of churches are calling for the government to enact stuff, right? The lesson, just look to the Dark Ages. When church and state combine like that, there is always a problem. It never ends well. How the Roman church can clear itself from the charge of idolatry, we cannot see. And this is the religion which Protestants are beginning to look unto with much favor, and which we eventually. So basically, what this section is saying, be careful what we're asking for. The Roman church remains constant. It's always behind the scenes. What they're saying that will change in this situation is the Protestants. The Protestants will now align themselves closer and closer to the Roman church. And what would eventually happen? The state will be used as a force to dictate what people do. We are not to vote from a Democratic, Republican, liberal, conservative, Protestant, Catholic, or even American framework, but from an Adventist one. Though we occupy between the King of the North and the King of the South, we serve the King of the universe. And that's who we're supposed to be reflecting on. Because when we start down this road, it's very difficult for us to come back. Number 6, get involved as an Adventist. The people of God will recognize human government as an ordinance of divine appointment and will teach obedience to it as a sacred duty within its legitimate sphere. The banner of truth and religious liberty has in this last conflict been committed to us, and we can appreciate these truths only as we search the scriptures for truths. These schools of prophecies were intended, so basically this section, what it's saying is, there were schools set up to teach our young people, because if we look at Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, we look at Daniel, right? So the conclusion here is Adventists should continue their training Waldensian students to sit in legislatures, educating our own Daniels and Joseph. Let us not trust others, but involve our own. Number 7, rely on sacred faith. We are not to come down from our position of ever remaining a people distinct and peculiar from the world. Our vocation is high, holy, and elevated. Our faith, if appreciated, will keep all true believers from political strife. The fires of the last day will consume many souls who might have been saved if the church had but comprehended her sacred responsibilities. As ambassadors of Christ, may we use our involvement in a sacred way. The take-home message, whatever we are doing, we do it for Christ. We cannot get involved in things that create discord. And sometimes as church members, we do that. Christ is saying, let's go down the middle. If something is going to offend someone, don't post it on social media. If something is going to take us away, because everything I do, I'm representing Christ. Though individual Adventists are called to sacred political involvement, the church is not a political organization. So we should not be standing from the pulpit here and politicizing anything. Adventist leader and editor F. M. Wilcox best sums it up here. The Seventh-day Adventist Church does not seek to dictate to its members as to how they should vote or whether or not they should vote at all. It is left for each one to act on his own judgment in the fear of God. We have been told by the servant of the Lord that we should not link up with political parties, that we should not agitate political questions in our schools or institutions. On the other hand, we have been instructed by the same author that when certain moral issues such as prohibition are involved, the advocates of temperance fail to do their whole duty unless they exert their influence by precepts and example, but by voice and pen and vote in favor of total abstinence. If something is against, we're advocating. Here, you support it. This instruction is not mandatory. It is still left for each one to determine for himself what he should do. And the last paragraph, I'm done. Everybody's happy. I'm happy. We're almost done. Last paragraph. While an individual member of the church has a right, if he so likes, to cast his vote, the church as such should hold itself entirely aloof from politics. It is one thing for the individual member of the church to vote, and another thing for those same individuals in their church capacities to endeavor to influence political measures. So what's the take-home message from this? The bottom line is, let's seek God. Politics will come and go. Let's seek God. We are not going to stand here and politicize. We're not going to go during the political season and post whatever we want on Facebook and do whatever we want. We have to remember this. We are representing Christ in everything we do. Remember, we are between the King of the North and King of the South. Let us do God's will in every situation.